Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. It's so great to have you here, Gerald. So I'm super excited about this because I love Motown. Is there anybody who doesn't? I mean, I can't imagine that that is even the case, but I exceptionally love it, and I don't know anything about it. So Gerald is an attorney turned investigative author. He is a Pulitzer finalist and New York Times bestselling author of 13 books, ranging from biographies of Joseph Mengele or Mengele, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, and Ross Perot, to reinvestigations of the JFK and Martin Luther King assassinations, as well as books about 9/11, Saudi Arabia, the heroin trade, finances, and the Vatican. And his last book about the American drug industry. It's a merciless pit bull of an investigator, said the Chicago Tribune, and he's a regular guest on CNN, Fox, and NBC. His book, Motown Music, Money, Sex, and Power, was published in 2000 to rave reviews. Quote, the most objective and accurate history of the label, unquote. That's San Francisco Chronicle. It is the untold business story behind the hit music. It's a pleasure to have you here, Gerald, and take it away from here and let's learn about Motown. I feel like I want to play some background music, but it'll just be going through my head.
I think of that often, Anastasia, that if I'm talking about Motown, most people are probably thinking, you know, just be quiet and let's hear some of the music. It would be probably a better presentation. I'm very, very happy to be here today to talk to the Golden Gate Breakfast Club. It's a treat, and I enjoyed some of the advice I just picked up from some of you as I was listening earlier. Actually, I'm here because Anastasia got hold of me through email a few months ago and said, by the way, I've heard about your work. You're a journalist, an investigative reporter. You must be a big believer in free speech. Now, I thought that was a little odd. I mean, for a first time, like email asking me about free speech, but all right, fair enough. I get a lot of different emails. So I said, yes, I'm a big adamant believer and defender of free speech. And she said, that's fantastic because that's exactly what you're going to be giving on September 14th before the Golden Gate Breakfast Club. And I tell you, I can't believe I fell for that, but I will be on the alert next time. But that was very good, Anastasia. I am here to talk to you today about probably one of the most enjoyable books that I and my wife, Patricia, who works with me. She's my research assistant when I'm putting my name on the bottom of a book. I'm her research assistant when she's putting her name on the bottom of a book. I end up doing more of them, it seems sometimes, because she doesn't like the limelight, but we enjoy this. And this was one of the most enjoyable that we did. I have a PowerPoint I've prepared for today, and I think that we'll take up the screen in a moment. I'll talk over these slides, but then I will come back for those of you I've confused, and you will be able to ask me questions to straighten anything out. But I think it'll bring to our images that I'm talking about will become real as you see some of these. And hopefully it will be seamless, as I always say with technology. And if it's working, you will see now, I think, just a large group, sort of a shelf of books. Unless somebody is screaming and shouting to me, I'll assume that is right.
No, we're not seeing your screen other than you.
It would be good if I shared my screen on Zoom. Thank you. The host has disabled participant screen sharing. Is it possible that somebody could enable screen sharing for me?
Okay, can you do that, Craig?
I can't do it on my side. Pete, can you enable that portion?
Enable screen sharing? Okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you.
Sorry, Gerald. Our
problem.
President
No problem at all.
Here.
It's good to occasionally keep a speaker on their toes to make sure. As a matter of fact, there was a time when we, pre-pandemic, when we had the ability to be in person, when I really didn't use a PowerPoint or anything like it at all. I sort of just gave the talk, and I enjoyed that because there's an interaction, as you know so well, that you get with your audience. Some people are nodding, some people are getting a little drowsy, some people are taking a break. I mean, with Zoom, I can't quite tell if everybody is loving it and on the edge of their seats, or if you've all taken a break and just put up a screenshot that looks like you're sitting there and you've gone off to do something else. So there's a bit of faith that I have to have in it. Let me see. I still can't quite yet share yet. So, but I will say as a background, and we can skip the first few slides when we get there. I have done a lot of different projects, and it did start with a pro bono legal project in the early 1980s in which I represented twins who had been experimented on by Joseph Mengele. And as it turned out, that led to the first book, Mengele. And I think that I can now share with you. You should be able to see what look like mountains and a...
Yay, we
Yeah,
are
fair
in
enough.
like Flynn.
All right, fair
Done.
enough. And then now you should see a shelf of books. And that's pretty much what you heard a moment ago from Anastasia. So it started with a biography on Joseph Mengele, and I've done books on the heroin trade, and Trish and I were in Southeast Asia and the Golden Triangle for a long time, and we've done books on interviews with sons and daughters of Nazi criminals. The books you heard about on the King and Kennedy assassinations, the Perot biography. The Motown book is sort of right in the middle. To the right of the Motown book, you'll see Trisha's first book that she published with Random House, Her Passage Through Menopause Without Hormones. This is not your mother's menopause. Well, that, was not my title, but it was hers, and it was a very successful book. Why America Slept About 9/11, a book that she followed up with called No Hormones, No Fear. A book about Saudi Arabia, which got us banned from the kingdom, I'm proud to say. A book about Miami Beach, and then God's Bankers, a 200-year history of the finances of the Vatican, before Trisha's last bestseller, The Pharmacist of Auschwitz, about the pharmacist who ran the dispensary at Auschwitz. And yes, The Drug Industry was my last book, published right at the start of the pandemic, March 2020. My advice to young writers and authors, the best advice I have, and it took me 40 years to almost pick it up, and that is, do not publish a book when bookstores across the country close. I understand that doesn't happen very often, but it happened with the pandemic, so not the best timing. Motown did come out in 2000. The hardcover is there. On the left, on the right is the paperback that was put out, and that book did hit a nerve. Anastasia told you about some of the great reviews that came for it. And the reason that Trish and I were able to do a book about the business of Motown different than any other that had been done was we always ask ourselves the first question, which is, what can we do that hasn't already been done? Many of the stars of Motown had their own autobiographies out. There were books that had been written about Motown. There were great music books. And what we did is we headed to Detroit, where we spent literally a couple of months over a period of time in the basement of that building. That building is the Wayne County Courthouse. Built in the 1960s, the archives there are a time capsule of cardboard boxes and rows of metal filing cabinets and wires dangling from the ceiling. Didn't look like it could pass a very good safety inspection at the time. But in there was the untold story of the label. And what I mean by that is every good Motown relationship that started off with such great promise and stars, and these were kids, many of them, when they signed with the label, when things went sour and they were no longer having the hits, or they weren't happy with the label and they left 10 or 15 years later, there was almost always a lawsuit about it. And the depositions for those lawsuits, even when they settled, were settled inside that basement. And they provided a really untold history of the label that nobody had had. Of course, it all comes back to this fellow right here, who most of you will recognize, Berry Gordy Jr., 7th of 8 children. His father was the son of free Georgia slaves and had moved to Detroit for assembly line work 7 years before Berry was born. We think of Detroit, a lot of people can't imagine that it was such a booming city, but in 1920, it was the second fastest growing city in America. It had a 1,200% increase in population over a decade. People were moving there because of work with the auto assembly lines. And Berry's parents were strict disciplinarians. They brought him up with the idea that it was important to work. So his idea for what he wanted to do for his own career was to become an amateur boxer. Excuse me for the sip of water. Now, Berry was only 5'6", weighed about 125 pounds. Fortunately for us and the rest of the world, he wasn't a very good boxer, because we eventually got Motown instead of a boxing career. At 20 in 1950, He decided boxing was too tough, and he opted for his second love, which was songwriting. And he thought maybe he could make a business out of that. He runs into a 17-year-old kid with an unmistakable falsetto and a group called the Matadors at the time, William Robinson, Smokey Robinson, as we know him later. And they become friends. And Gordy introduced himself and said, "I'll release your single for you." And they did. They pressed a piece of vinyl and they released it on Smokey's 18th birthday. A small little local hit called "Got a Job." It was the first foray that Berry Gordy had taken into music, with obviously some very good talent. And he decides to form a company. He first calls it Tamla, after Debbie Reynolds' hit song Tammy of the time. And he gets Barrett Strong, he signs, and they do a song called Money, which becomes a hit. The woman on the right is a young girl at the time, Mary Wells. She stopped Gordy when he was leaving a popular club in Detroit called the 20 Grand and said, Mr. Gordy, I have a song for you. And he said, no, later, let me know, try to get a hold of me later. And she said, no. She stopped him right there and she started to sing to him at the spot in front of all these people. And he said, you're great. And then he ends up putting out Mary Wells's first song for her. There were some lessons that he learned at that time. Those two songs, the Mary Wells song and the Barrett Strong song, were distributed by other companies, Black-owned record companies like Chess out of Chicago. They reached #2 on the R&B charts. In the two cities in which Gordy didn't deal with those distributors, he dealt with independents, indies as they were called. He made more money on those songs than he did in the rest of the country. That was his lesson that convinced him he had to do it all alone. He had to become a vertically integrated company. So Motown would have to press the songs, they would have to do the distribution, they would have to get everything out. Now, that was easier said than done, but that was his ambitious goal. So he starts a company, Motown Records, Hitsville, out of a house at 2648 West Grand Street in 1959. Motown becomes officially incorporated in 1960. The business that Gordy entered was pretty segregated in terms of black and white. Small black independents did focus on playing just black artists on black records. But though the big singers of the time who were black, like Aretha Franklin, Nat King Cole, they were all released on major labels like RCA and Decca. They were a handful of those. They were played both on black radio and on white radio. But for the rest of the industry, there was that color line. And so one of the things that Gordy wanted, he had a different idea from the beginning. He wanted to cross black singers over to white radio and to white record listeners and buyers. It was unheard of. Sell pop, white R&B, it's a much bigger and more lucrative market. His goal, he told his sister, was 70% of all the sales from any song should be coming from listeners and buyers that should be white. People just rolled their eyes and thought it couldn't happen. But, you know, he was assembling a team that could make it happen. These three people here are probably responsible for most of the Motown hits that you can hum and think of, that we grew up with and that we love so much. Lamont Dozier and the brothers Eddie and Brian Holland, they were wannabe singers who Gordy meets early on in 1960. They become a songwriting team inside the house, and he creates with them what he calls an assembly line. 3 minutes or less the songs will be. They have a catchy chorus, no politics involved. He gets an in-house band called the Funk Brothers, some of the best musicians in Detroit at the time, to play background. And he has Smokey and the Miracles and others ready to go. But he also has in this production line of songs that are coming out with 3 minutes or less, a very important thing. They have to sound like pop more than R&B, he says. They have to emphasize a catchy chorus, and there have to be no politics involved. Gordy wanted to be free of politics so that he could sell to everybody. Now, remember before I was telling you about the fact that the business was pretty segregated? Gordy knew that. And so what he did, he went out and he got what he created inside of Motown, employees in the A&R division, distributors who could get his songs played on white radio stations, and not only get it distributed into stores that were selling records for white artists, but then collect the money that was owed. So he went out and he got Barney Ailes, the fellow that you see with the goatee, sitting in one picture on the edge of the picture and standing in the other. He worked for Capitol Records. Barney Ailes becomes one of the most important people in Motown, and probably somebody you've never heard of. He joined Motown at the age of 27, and he was responsible for the distributors initially out of New York and Washington. His job was to get those records played, get them distributed efficiently around the country. And he hired a group of workers inside of Motown. They were all white, who broke the sort of the barrier of race, and they did get Motown records played everywhere. There's a scene early on that I described in the book in which Barney Ailes and Gordy go to an upscale restaurant in Detroit. This is about 1961. And the maitre d' says, "I'm sorry, we don't serve colored people." And Gordy, without missing a beat, says, "That's okay, I don't need them." And something of interest is that the white employees at Motown were often asked by their family members and other record industry executives, what's it like to work for a black company? And Barney Ailes had the great line, "The money is green." And that would end the discussion pretty much for everybody. The number one, the first crossover hit that they got was on it made American Bandstand. It was number one on the R&B charts and number two on the pop charts. That was Shop Around, and it is by the Miracles and Smokey. The Gordy was furious it didn't get to number one in the pop charts. Sitting there with Smokey is Esther Gordy. She formed a company inside of Motown called International Talent Management. And together with her sister Gwen, they did it all. Motown acted as the agents for the artists. They acted as their lawyers, the unofficial bank. They paid their IRS. They did the contracts. Motown even created a finishing school with one of Detroit's leading fashion sort of doyens, Maxine Powell. She was called Miss Manners, and she would teach all the new acts how to do everything from shaking hands to walking with balancing books on their head, for the girls for how to sit when they were on live TV. And it was that finishing school so that when they had the hits, they went out without missing a beat, if you want to say. Gordy also had a lot of talent. He found this kid in 1960 at the age of 10, Stevie Wonder. This is a picture of him from 1963. Gordy's company, Motown, became the legal guardian for Stevie. And Stevie initially was paid $2.50 a week until he had some hits that would pay royalties. But that was the type of music talent that Gordy was signing. Here, you'll recognize those women on the left. They were teenagers then. It's Diana Ross, Florence Ballard, Mary Wilson, and Barbara Martin, who later drops out. They're the original Supremes around 1961. They're high school girls from the Brewster Projects. They signed with Motown. They hung around the offices waiting for a hit. This was when Diana Ross was only 17. Gordy later recounted, and I have this, I talk about this in the book. He said their audition, in which they did this a cappella version of the Drifters' "There Goes My Baby," it was so-so, but their extreme self-confidence won him over. They were signed to the label as the Primettes when Gordy decided they needed a better name, and it was Flo who came up with the words the Supremes. They were the sweethearts of Motown. Barbara left in 61 when she got pregnant, and they had to wait a little bit for their hits. You'll recognize here later on, you would know him by the songs that he would do in a later time, but sorry about that. But here is in 22 years old in 1961, Marvin Gaye. He was dating Gordy's sister Anna behind Gordy's back. Gordy didn't know it at the time. He signed to the label, and he took a little time before he had a hit. Entrance in a rural high school talent show in 61, the Marvelettes, within months of signing with Barry, had delivered the label's first #1 pop hit, "Please Mr. Postman." And on the right, Otis Williams in the distance might not have ended up at Motown if it hadn't been for Otis having a torrid affair with Mary Wells. She brought him to Gordy, and he signed them as the Temptations. So the amount of talent that's being signed to the label is pretty hard to beat. This is early 62, and here you can see Mary Wells, Berry Gordy is there playing the piano, Smokey's there, Stevie Wonder. It's a group that for them is just a normal evening. For us, we look back at it and think what an unbelievable array of people. In 62, Gordy sends them out on a national tour. Well, it's on a bus. It's not very luxurious or anything else, but it's called the 1962 Motor Review. Pulling together that was a daunting task for a small company like Motown, a Herculean task. Everyone worked in-house, the artists, the producers, the background singers, the musicians. And for Gordy, that tour promoted the company and helped promote the artists as well. But it was tough on the chaperones because they were really kids, and the Marvelettes were all 18. Mary Wells and Diana Ross were also 18. Flo Ballard was 19. The oldest artists on that trip were Martha Reeves and the Vandellas at 20 and 21. So they took that tour. here they are as they were dressed. And as you would imagine, working together, living together, working under one company household, and being as young as they were, they ended up having affairs together and sometimes getting married. So the first was another Motown artist, Claudette. She married Smokey Robinson. All of Gordy's sisters married in the business. Gwen married Harvey Fuqua, and Anna married Marvin Gaye. Lucia originally married a saxophonist, Ron Wakefield. Gordy's niece, Iris, she married the producer, Johnny Bristol. Mary Wells married a Ray Bar singer, Herman Griffin. The Marvelettes, Wanda Young, married the Miracles, Bobby Rogers. Georgiana Dobbins, one of the Marvelettes, married the Contours, Billy Gordon. And A&R director Mickey Stevenson married Kane Weston. In addition to the marriages, there were affairs all over the place. So Mary Wilson would be with Hetty Kendricks and later with Duke Faulkner of the Four Tops. A 16-year-old Gladys Horton, the Marvelettes paired off with Hubert Johnson of the Contours, and Otis William of the Temps was with the Supreme Flow Ballards when Diana Ross was with Barry himself, but nobody knew it. The great thing was when all those relationships were working well and people were happy and they were in love, everything was fine. But as you know, when personal relationships get rocky or hit the rocks or something happens, there's recriminations and a little bit of bitterness that goes along with it. And later that would become a problem in Motown time and time again. December of '62, the highlight for Gordy and the tour, they make the Apollo Theater in Harlem, Miracles, Contours, Marvelettes. You look back at this period, it's Marvin Gaye with Martha and the Vandellas at the Apollo Theater in December. What does Gordy do? He turns it into an album that he releases. It becomes one of their best-selling. He takes that entire performance at the Apollo and makes it today a collector's item. Famous, for Motown hits like My Girl and Get Ready. I think the Temps set the standard in this early 60s period for their polished choreography. And this is them also at the theater in '64. But looking at the Temps in black and white isn't quite the same as looking at them in color. We forget sometimes the amazing amount of what they brought to the stage and how they worked. And Gordy was so successful with this tour that he ends up doing it for the UK. He sends a Tamla Motown UK tour over, many of the same artists in 1965. They end up performing at all over the UK. My wife, Trisha, who grew up in London, was 14 at this time. She was not a Rolling Stones or Beatles fan, but she loved Motown. Her mother would not let her go to one of these concerts, unfortunately, but she looks at that longingly and wishes she had been there. And here's some of the performers in Motown at Marble Arch. The top row is the Miracles, the middle row the Temps, and the bottom row is the Supremes. And appropriate, they have the umbrellas necessary often for London weather. March 19th, 1965 is when they do the performances. They have it at the EMI house. They are ready to go. This is one of the most famous of that day. It's Martha and the Vandellas with Dusty Springfield on a special that was taped and broadcast on the UK. And they really established Motown, the label, and the artist almost overnight. The Supremes, as you know them, Ed Sullivan, they are starting to get their hits now, and Stop in the Name of Love and others are moving them up the charts. But Gordy doesn't stop signing people. In 1968, Bobby Taylor and the Vancouvers, he discovered a group of 5 talented young brothers from Gary, Indiana, and he brought them to Motown's attention. The audition so impressed Gordy, he signed them that day as the Jackson 5. They'd driven in from Gary, Indiana, a VW bus. They did a version of the Temps' Ain't Too Proud to Peg. He said he was mesmerized by the youngest of the group, Michael Jackson. And the Jacksons are soon also on Sullivan and performing. By 1969 and 1970, Gordy has the success that he'd always dreamed of. In Motown, in Detroit, he's big news. I mean, he buys a small, what you call chateau mansion style inside. It's quite deluxe. He has a painter who does a large portrait of him that greets people when you come into the front area that looks like Barry is Napoleon, not at Waterloo, obviously, but in his great victory. So these are the best days of Motown in many ways. In early '71, Marvin Gaye comes to Gordy and says, I want to do a protest album. And Gordy's response, flippant, and I describe this in detail in the book, but he says, protest about what? Now think of this. This is 1971. We're a year before the re-election of Richard Nixon. We've been through Vietnam. There's a whole Watergate is breaking out, and Gordy says protest about what? Gaye offered him a smorgasbord of gripes: Vietnam, social conditions, police brutality. Gave him a list. A lot of stuff, he said. Gordy said, I think you're taking things too far. But Marvin, if nothing else, was stubborn, and he had a reputation for it. He was not dissuaded. He said, I'm not happy with this world. I'm angry and I have to sing about it. I have to protest. So Gordy said, all right, if you do it, stick to what works. Don't do something different. At least make it commercial. And Marvin produced What's Going On. That album and that song, I listen to it sometimes today, still relevant for today. An amazing song. First time Motown ever dips into politics at all. And Gordy saw it as a success. It didn't change his mind that other artists should be political, but he did acknowledge that Marvin was right. And then Marvin kept driving him crazy. He would get in politics all the time. Gordy would try to keep him out. Here he is, as a matter of fact, with Shirley Temple Black, who was then the ambassador to the UN, U.S. Ambassador and Secretary General Kurt Waldheim, discussing an African literacy campaign. For Gordy, that was all too much, but Gaye would not stop. This is also the time when Motown's near its height, that there are rumors in the alternative press and some of the recording press, the industry trades, that Motown might have been taken over by the Mafia. That Gordy, he was an inveterate gambler. He would gamble on everything. So the rumors were that he was in debt to loan sharks because of his gambling. They had bailed him out by taking out shares in Motown. On a trip to the Caribbean, rumors was he had been kidnapped and had to sign over some of the ownership. Barney Ailes, who you met before, was running the distributorship. Unfortunately, had a Sicilian background, and so that fueled those rumors. Mike Roshkin, the fellow with the tie that you see right in the middle here, became a top PR executive. There are rumors that he was associated with the Jewish mob. I investigated those for months and months when I was doing the Motown book to see if there was any truth to it, and there wasn't in the end. They tell a great story if you're writing a novel or fiction, but Motown wasn't mobbed up. It made its success on its own. The Mafia didn't come in. There was a story I uncovered, chapter 23, called Suitcases of Cash, in which you'll see Gordy there with some of the fellows who were involved in the sales department. And one of them, who is the second from right, he is Mike Lushka. He describes an intricate, detailed sort of routine that they had, a scheme in which they would fake the amount of records sold when they sent royalty statements to the artist, and they would pick up suitcases of cash from the distributors and distribute it among themselves. When I say among themselves, talking about those fellows who were in the record sales department and in the distributor department. Never goes up to Gordy. There's no evidence that it ever went to Gordy or any of the family. So the artists were getting ripped off at a certain point, and the people who were ripping them off were keeping that money. No one was ever prosecuted for it, but it wasn't a mafia operation by any means. In 1972, Dozier Holland left Motown after a bitter lawsuit, and Gordy was moving west from to LA because he wanted to get in the movie business. Gladys Horton, lead singer of the Marvelettes, wouldn't go with him, and others stayed. The Funk Brothers wouldn't go. The company was taken over in Detroit by Ewart Abner. He's a president from 1973 and on. He was militantly Afrocentric, and many of the white executives left at that time. Some describe him on the record as an unrepentant racist, but the company started to splinter in Detroit in terms of the music company. And in LA, where Gordy was, he decided to focus on Diana Ross, who was still the love of his life in many ways, although they still weren't public. That little infant girl in front of Diana Ross there, that is a child that she and Gordy had that no one knew was their child at the time. And that's Rhonda. She is the one who's closest, Diana Ross is, with Michael Jackson. And Gordy finds a vehicle for her finally in Lady Sings the Blues. And for all of us who have seen that, it seemed as though it was tailor-made for Diana, although it was really her vehicle into movie making. It portrayed Billie Holiday. She won rave reviews. She had an Oscar nomination, a Golden Globe. She was up for the Best Actress at Cannes, and it looked like Gordy's dream of making Motown a movie company might work. The problem was that Diana wasn't liked by Motown music fans, and this is her in 1976 when she returned to Detroit to the funeral of Flo Ballard, one of the original Supremes. Many thought she had the most talent, and she had been forced out of the group with these bad battles that took place between the singers a few years earlier. And when Diana attended her funeral, she was literally surrounded by 4 burly bodyguards and hissed and booed by the Motown fans, who really thought that she was the villainess in it. So it was a strange time for Diana Ross. movie success, but losing her fan base in Detroit for Motown. What ruins Diana Ross's movie career and Motown's movie enterprise, they follow up with Mahogany. Some of you may remember that. It lost a little money, but the big flop was 1978, The Wiz. It was a $25 million production. It sold nothing at all. CBS ended up losing big on it. So did Universal, and Motown's movie operation is essentially dead at that point. In 1983, many of you might have seen it. Motown had a 25-year anniversary that was shown on NBC, and it was a great collection of artists, but it was also a reminder of what might have been. Among its highlights that night was Michael Jackson's performance of Billie Jean, the first time he had ever performed on television, the moonwalk. And unfortunately, we all had to remember that Jackson 5 had left Motown quite a while ago. Diana Ross got up and came back with Someday We Will Be Together. But when the mic was off of them, there was a moment caught by TV cameras in which she sort of shoves her colleague, Mary Wilson, and says, "I've taken care of that." David Ruffin and Eddie Kendricks were not invited. The original temp leads, Martha Reeves and Mary Wells' songs, were cut to a verse each, and they complained about it later. So even the 25th anniversary left behind some bitter memories. And then, of course, there was the next year in which the low point for me in terms of Motown. Marvin Gaye, who had hit bad times in terms of drugs and depression, living with his father, and in this violent fight that they have, Marvin was shot dead by his father. And I think that was the moment at which Motown hits its nadir in many stages, this loss of this incredible talent and a personal tragedy as well, and so much of what had been this great label dissembling. In the 70s and 80s, there were far fewer hit acts. Lionel Richie was around. He was producing some. The Commodores, that was one of the few bright spots. Some of you may remember a funk punk king, he self-described, Rick James, with X-rated lyrics. They don't seem so outrageous today in the day of hip hop and rap lyrics, but at the time they were quite eye-racing, and he was Motown's big outrageous act, including onstage dope smoking and X-rated lyrics. It was a far cry from the 3-minute catchy pop songs that Gordy had produced with Holland, Dozier, and Holland for the early stars. The late 80s, Motown is sort of a shadow of its former self. When Diana Ross joined the three songwriters, Holland, Dozier, and Holland, they were inducted in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. None of them were still with the label. And when Gordy himself finally is inducted in the Hall of Fame, he had by that time sold Motown to a group of private investors for $61 million, an investment group called Boston Ventures. He later sold the rights to the songs that he had created because he kept the music catalog. He was very, very smart. Half of it to EMI for $132 million. And then in 2003, sold another 30% to EMI for another $110 million. And in 2004, he sold 20% to EMI for the last $80 million. So all told, Gordy sold the rights to the song and Motown itself for $320 million. He says in his own autobiography, "I went from $800 to tens of millions. I had done it. I had won the poker hand." Still thinking in terms of the gambling, to Gordy, that was the big victory. And on this, I'm going to wrap up here so we have some time for questions and answers, and I can come back to you separate from these sides. If this works, you'll hear 20 seconds of some sound from Motown. Realize what we've all been missing this time.
On the country today, with the song that brought them to the top of the record field, they're good-looking youngsters with long hair, and on them it looks good because they're girls. The Supreme.
So it's timeless music, and maybe it's generational because I can listen to it, Trisha can listen to it. It sounds as fresh to us as it did when they were writing it. There are not a lot of songs like that, and not a lot of music like that. But as always, there's never a single story that is always all good, all positive, and no downside. And so this is the wonderful tale in the end of a group of incredibly talented people and a visionary in terms of Berry Gordy, who created something that we had never seen before, unique, and in many ways won't be repeated. I just leave you with this thought. Today, if a young, talented artist is signing with a music label, they're represented by an agent and by an attorney. It was very rare not to be. In LA and New York, they were back then, but this was Detroit. It was off the beaten path a little bit. And so they weren't coming to Gordy at 16, 17, and 18 with agents and attorneys. And Gordy said, we can do it all for you. And so they did it all for them. And that later created problems when they thought they weren't getting a correct counting. But it meant that they had this relationship with the record company and with the family that ran it that is unusual and unique and probably won't be repeated. And that's why it's such a wonderful story to tell as a journalist or as an author. So thank you very, very much for your patience in listening to this. And I'm happy to stay here for a little bit till the top of the hour to answer any questions.
Well, thank you. That was absolutely unbelievably amazing. And I know that I am not alone thinking, wow, I'd love to hear a speech on every single book he's ever written or even thought about writing. Absolutely amazing. And thank you for honoring us with your appearance and certainly your willingness to answer questions. We have two hands up, but as the host, I want to ask the first. How many speaking engagements do you accept, and are you looking for more?
Yes, so yes, I have actually a speaker's agent in Boston, American Speakers Bureau, that represents me. Although but I do it. I sometimes have to remind them that I'm one of their speakers, and I do enjoy doing talks, and they tend to come in clumps. Most of them. So you'll all understand this, and you will as an author as well, Patricia. I think that people often go to a speaker who has a unified background. You're going to listen to Henry Kissinger because he was Secretary of State or whatever. You want to listen to somebody who's been involved in technology because they're going to tell you how tech is going to ruin the minds of every 12 and 13 and 14-year-old child out there, or whatever it is. I tend to get somebody interested in Motown, but they may not be interested in Joseph Mengele and the history of Nazis, or they may not be interested in the finance of the Vatican. So I tend to get different groups in times. They come, yeah, it is eclectic, as my wife Patricia says, who's sitting over here on the side, who's tortured to have to listen to these all the time. But I do enjoy giving it, and I must say that Anastasia was fantastic because she didn't give up. Just so you all know this, there are like 3 or 4 dates that we had earlier, and then something came up, and then this came up, and then that came up, and she was just great because she would give me a little bit of time and come back and say, okay, thanks, how's the rest of life? You're still alive, when are you going to talk to us? And so that's what you need.
Well, thank you very much. Certainly, I will remind the American Speakers Bureau how fabulous you are. You have a lot of people here who are very active and visible members in the speaking industry in the National Speakers Association. All right, who has the first hand up? Okay.
That would be Anastasia.
Anastasia, then we have Alan Garber. So Anastasia, you first.
Thank you. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to limit it to 2. One is, where did the name Motown come from? So that's one question. I'm guessing motor vehicles in town. Is that right? Okay.
Motor City.
Motor City
it was called because that was one of its nicknames then.
Got it. Okay, so that was that. And then secondly, any of your books and or Trisha's, are any of them available as far as audio, like an audible version? If so, who narrates it? But my sense is like the photographs that you were sharing, this is one of my, I'm a huge Audible person, but I miss out on books with photos. And I'm just curious, like your Motown book, I want to get that. I'm assuming there are photographs in the book, and therefore I would miss out if I did the audio version. Can you give us a sense of that with you, with some of your other books? And
Yeah,
Trisha's too, especially the Auschwitz one.
yeah, no. It's very interesting because yes, so they're not all on Audible because Motown's not on Audible, but all the recent books are. So the only one, Perot, I read, and I then learned how difficult it is to be, as a matter of fact, to do voiceover and to do that work. I have a new respect for it because I can't tell you how many times there'd be a little lisp, or they would hear a sound, or my stomach would be gurgling and I'd have to give that line again. So what I thought was a 3-hour job became a full day. So since then, they've been smart enough to always have me listen to a couple of voices of people they're thinking of reading who do that for a living. And I say, oh, that would be a great voice for that. And we choose someone. I like Audible. Increasingly, I used to be just a paper person. So for me, it was all about I needed a book like this because I like to go through and mark it up on paper, and I draw things on the side and I make comments. I can remember in my head, because I grew up in a pre-digital age, where a comment is. I can see it in the red line. I have to flip sometimes through the pages to find it, but I don't have that same sticky memory when it's on a Kindle and I've marked it up. And so I didn't listen to Audible or audiobooks for a long time, but I've recently become a fan of it for long books, like my pharma book or that, in which the two things that happen, if it's a good reading, you get into the story and you're not just swayed by the fact that there are 500 pages ahead of you. You don't think about that. And there's something nice about that in the in-between. You're absolutely right about the pictures. We put a lot of time into getting photographs that work for the book. And for those of you, and I think that you'll all know this, and any of you who have written books will know this, you try to get pictures that do not have a copyright on them, because you don't want to pay a photo service a lot of money to put them inside your book, because that's not what's selling your book. But you still want interesting pictures. So we sometimes go through hundreds and hundreds of pictures to select the ones that they want. And we did that, by the way, on the drug industry, on pharma. And just as a sidelight, sometimes the best laid plans, my editor at Simon & Schuster said at the end, the book's already very big. It's going to cost us a lot of money to produce. Photo insert will just be more money. So let's leave the photos out. So unfortunately, you're missing nothing on the Audible there.
It was hard to pick the pharmacy book.
And if you are please talking, mute yourself. And Carl Walsh has done a little research on your behalf, and Pharma, Case Closed, and Killing the Dream are on Audible for us.
Also, The Pharmacist of Auschwitz is available.
Good. Thank you, Carl. And Alan Garber, then Tim Durkin.
Hi, Gerald. I have two questions for you. First one is, did Motown ever sign any white artists? And my second question is, that stack of books behind your left shoulder, has it ever got knocked over and fallen down?
No, but I'll answer them in reverse order. That particular vertical stack of books has not been knocked down. Occasionally, I worry that the ones that I put in myself as those floating shelves above the doorway are going to fall on my head or Trisha's head at one point, and the little obituary in the New York Times will say killed by his own books. Should have written thinner books. But no, so far we've been pretty good on that. Motown did sign its first white artist was actually a person who won one of the early song contests, and he had a great voice. And I'm trying to think of his name. Trisha and I are both. It was in the, I'd say, early 2000s, late 90s, and he was a singer on the first of the great, I think it might have even been with Ed McMahon, who might have had that talent show for those voices. And Motown said, "You're our fellow." And he had almost an R&B type quality voice. Very, very interesting, superb voice, but never became a big act.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. Tim Durkin.
Well, Gerald, I can't say enough about the outstanding research and compilation of all the facts behind the scenes and in front of the scenes that you did in My Beloved Motown. I say My Beloved Motown because I actually grew up in that neighborhood. My grandmother's garage was one house away from Hitsville. And I used to go swimming in Northern Recreation, and the Temptations and other acts would be in the ping pong room. And they would invite me in. They called me Face. Hey, Face, how you doing? And then I also grew up in the neighborhood with a guy named Steve Len Morse, who was really a lot of fun to play with because he could sing like crazy. And then we never saw him again after Fingertips Part 2 came out. That was Stevie Wonder. My question is, first of all, I can't give you enough kudos for the work that you've done. Would you consider doing something on Jeffrey Epstein?
I talked to my publisher about that, and I don't think I'm doing anything on Epstein, because here's the problem with the book, and you'll understand this. With a book, the way that I do it, I go to a publisher and say, this is what I'd like to do, but I don't yet know the whole story because I haven't done all of the research. You have to do the reporting afterwards. In the old-fashioned world of journalism, you didn't reach your conclusion before you did your research. So I know a lot of publishers like to know that they're getting a book that's going to say X, Y, or Z, but I sort of say, this is the subject. I think that I will find new things on it, but you have to be patient. And then they have to say, all right, we want to give you a small advance so you can pay your mortgage in the meantime, because this is how we pay our bills. But when you come back in 2 years, we'll publish the book on the 3rd year. We have to hope, A, the public's still interested, and B, that no other enterprising investigative journalist has gone ahead and done a 20,000 word piece for the New Yorker or the New York Times Magazine or wherever else that people say there's the real story of Epstein, or Epstein's diaries are found somewhere and published by. So there's potholes along the way. I usually don't like doing a story. I wouldn't mind doing a magazine piece, but I don't like doing a book that is in a race for news breaks with other journalists, if that makes sense, as odd as that is. So that's why I end up doing a book like The Finances of the Vatican. I do a book on the drug industry. There are people writing about those things all the time, but not in a way where it's a story on the front pages. I want to hope that the story I deliver becomes a front page story, because I'm going to have some news in there that the media will find shocking. But it keeps me away generally from going after what I call what seem like instantly good stories aren't always for book writers. We're slow. We're very slow in getting it done. I marvel at when I hear an event take place, some tragedy, and then remember when we grew up, there was a quickie, those quickie paperbacks would come out within 2 months of the event. There was a 6-day war with Israel. You'd have 6-day war books out 3 months later. I was amazed at that. It's a Herculean feat, but they get them out in no time at all. And I think to myself, they're not doing the same reporting. It's a different thing. They're compilating sort of what the news is of the moment. But I like to do it sort of the old, arduous, hard work way. By the way, one quick, if I ever do an update on Motown, I will be calling you to get some information about the neighborhood. And to answer the final, the previous question, which Tricia has just given me the answer to, thank you, Trish. Sam Harris was the first, right?
Sand Spring, Oklahoma.
Yeah, there it is.
Yep. Was the mob that you talked about the Purple Gang?
Yeah, it was the Purple Gang was the biggest suspect of the group, but they also thought that the Gambinos had worked their way in. And I think the terrible thing about the mob stories, besides being wrong, was it took away all of the credit from the people who actually deserved it. Gordy and the family and the stars and the songwriters, they made something out of nothing. And to say, oh, you know why? They really couldn't have done it if it hadn't been for the mafia in there muscling everybody aside, takes away all that glory. It really was one of those cases in which the stories were being repeated, but they just weren't accurate.
Well, I am so happy to hear that, because until this day, I thought they did have a major influence. And I, like you, resent the fact that it was stolen from the true artists. Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gerald, may I ask a question? First of all, I want to have to tell you, thank you very much for a fascinating presentation this morning. The first album I ever bought in my young life was Marvin Gaye's Greatest Hits. I'd be very interested in hearing you talk about the status the state of the art of music today. Is there anybody that you currently are listening to, or is pretty much like most of the rest of us probably, is your love in the past in terms of the music industry?
A lot of what we listen to around this house, the two of us, is music in the past. There's no doubt. But sometimes something happens in which an artist from back in the day gets revived in a popular sense. And a perfect example, Trisha had this British singer that she had long liked, Kate Bush. Kate Bush had a small cult following in England for years, but nobody really knew her in America. And then she's become now a hit with the Gen Z or younger generations because she's the theme song for Stranger Things, this hit show on Netflix or HBO or whatever. So she's come back. We listen to some new Kate Bush because she has new things out, and listen to some of the old ones as well. But I will say that I don't find music today, and this is obviously generational. I go to the gym, we go to a local gym and we work out. And if I don't have headphones, I can listen to what the music is that's being broadcast into the gym. And I will tell you, it's Greek to me.
Thank you.
I would Hussey, please.
Well, this is more of a comment, but yeah, it's like a lot of today's pop music is just all hook and no development. There's not a lot of musicianship involved. And that's the thing that really struck me about Motown, was the musicianship was tremendous. I mean, they could get more music in 2 minutes than a lot of pop artists today can in twice or 3 times that amount of time. And it's like watching was there any like general background of the side musicians in terms of who influenced them, who did they learn from, before they got into the studio and got managed by Gordy?
Yeah, so Colin, so interesting you asked this, because I just finished Life is Funny. Things come out of left field sometimes. So I got approached by somebody I didn't know from the Library of Congress who said, oh, we have a program for the National Register. We put songs on every year. Some songs get put into the National Register. They become part of the treasured history of the United States. And in 2022, we're putting on the 4 tops. Reach out. I'll be there. We'd like you to write the essay for it. So I said, sure. And when I went back to go into my files and tell that story again, Trish and I both had forgotten that the influence for that song was really from the songwriters, Holland, Dozier, and Holland. They were the 3 songwriters, and they were being influenced by Dylan. So they said Dylan was talking and singing his song. So they wanted, if you listen to that song, Reach Out, I'll be there. They wanted, it to be talked and at the same time, a little bit of singing to go on. And it's interesting because the 4 tops resisted. They said, that's not what we do. We sing. They were sort of this wonderful Genio barbershop quartet almost. Right? They had these songs, they had a routine down. And Holland, Dozier, and Holland, together with the people who were playing in the back band, said, let's just experiment. So they experimented that day. They went on all day. They practiced it. And that was it. As far as the tops were concerned, that song might be released on a future album. They had one coming out next year, but would never be a single. They were in their car, one of them one day, when they heard it being played as a single about 6 months later, and they were furious. They went back to Gordy and they said, you can't release this song. This is experimental. It's not our sound. That becomes the biggest hit the Tops ever had. so it's fantastic to know. So they had a little Dylan they were channeling at that time, and at different points. You never think of Dylan, right, inspiring them, but that's who the songwriters were inspired by.
It brings to mind now, it's like another Detroit artist in hip hop, Jay Dilla, who probably sampled a lot of the Motown. And it's like a lot of the indie hip hop labels, that's what they go to for samples.
Yeah, and when you say that, one very quick thing, all the British artists, and I say all, but the Stones, the Beatles, they have these interviews back in 66, 67, 68, who were your influences, they're all talking about Motown. And they aren't talking about Motown because they think it's politically correct. They're talking about Motown influencing them because it really did. And so it had a tremendous impact on our rock and pop stars as they were first coming out.
Okay, I'm going to jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to acknowledge you.
Okay, Gerald, loved it. Grew up in Chicago. My very first concert was a smaller venue, Marvin Gaye. And as I'm sitting here, I'm looking at his cassette cover. My car was broken into, my Miata. It had a just, AM, whatever, didn't have a CD player back in the day. And the policeman came, is anything stolen? And I said, well, my Marvin Gaye's greatest hits is still in the cassette player. And I said, I'm very insulted. And the policeman said, if I would have broken in your car, I would have stolen your Marvin Gaye's greatest hits. But now, the question I have for you is, I remember being heartbroken when his father killed him. Do we know why his father did that?
I have a sort of a very sad chapter in the book on that. It is just a descent into the bottom of what the worst of drug addiction, and a sort of a violent relationship between the two of them that one day just crossed over the barrier. And it's just a tragedy. Knowing what the outcome is, you want to just stop the tape. You want to say, let's reverse it here and do it somehow differently, so it doesn't end up here, because it has this inevitability built to it, which is unfortunate. Yeah, it's a tragedy all the way around on that. And one thing, by the way, if I can say, you mentioned cassettes. We all had our cassettes at the time. And in the early days, Motown was releasing 45 singles. Many of us played them on those. Okay. Now, the trick for Motown and other big record companies was, if they knew they had a real hit, if that hit was taking off, would get to break into the top 10 or stay on the charts for a while, that would be the A side. The B side, if you look at a lot of the Motown songs, were songs that were weak. They didn't give you a second greatest hit because they knew you were buying the 45 for what was on the A side. The second side, though, would earn just as much money for the songwriters because they were selling as many copies as the A side writers. And sometimes on the B side, you will find on the early Motown 45s, Gordy as a songwriter. He was a wannabe songwriter, and he would get his songs on the B side. So those songs would often return a lot of money to Gordy. He was very smart at knowing how to do it. And one other thing, just a sidelight. Gordy was later asked, and I talk about this a little bit in the book later, people came to him and said, don't you think that you deserved sort of an obligation to give the young Black artists who signed with Motown better contracts than they got? They got industry heavy contracts that were all slanted toward the company. And Barry said, I wasn't involved in changing the world in terms of civil rights. I was making records, and I gave them the same contracts they would have gotten if they'd gone to a big record company like RCA or Universal. No better, no worse. And he never apologized for that. So the Gordy I end up understanding is about business first. He puts that's at the top. So it's not surprising to find he's co-written some of the B-side songs, if you ever see any of those old 45s.
Gerald, would you give us a snapshot of your Vatican book?
So I was raised in San Francisco with a Italian mother, a first-generation Catholic. I went to St. Vincent de Paul and then St. Ignatius College Prep. My father was a non-practicing Eastern European Jew, first generation, but no sense of Judaism in the family. And so I was even an altar boy. Did this book thinking that the story was really maybe about World War II and how they helped some Nazis get to South America. And I found out to my wonderment, of course, I should have realized it. It's not just a church. Pope's not just the vicar of Christ on earth, according to Catholicism. He's also running a sovereign country. He could have a flag at the UN. And it's different than any other religion that way. And the same cardinals who are doing the religious aspects are also running the secular parts. They don't always do that as well. And so it's a wild story of the Vatican Bank and how it becomes an offshore bank in the heart of Rome, used by mobsters. The mobsters that were not taking over Motown were partying their money in the Vatican Bank, and how it starts with a Vatican banker who was found under London Bridge in the 80s and goes on from there. Pope Francis is cleaning a lot of things up, but the story of what I call the cocaine cowboy days of Vatican financing is a fascinating one.
Well, I'm getting that as soon as possible. That one is not on Audible?
That is on Audible, but you hear me say that with some hesitation in my voice because I have to look myself to double check.
Okay, well, I'll look up as soon as we hang up. Now, we want to honor your time, and it is 9 o'clock. Our members can stay and chat for a little while. We have some late arrivers and a couple of guests, but Gerald, you have the opportunity to give us concluding remarks for as long as you want. If you have 30 minutes of concluding remarks, none of us are stopping, turning this off.
No, I want to thank you again. I want to thank you again for the opportunity. It's a great way to meet new people, new friends, and you're an interesting group. You have a lot going on, and so to hold your attention and get such great comments back means a lot to me. This strange business that Tricia and I have chosen of what I call working with basically books. We write articles and that, but books are the mainstay. It's a business that nobody can figure out, meaning the publishers don't know if you have a bestseller when they sign it. It's guesswork. Yes, if you're Michelle Obama or you're a celebrity and you're putting out a book, there's a certain amount. They often overpay for those. But at our level, they'll come up with some advance and then they're not quite sure if it works or not. And I leave you with this little example, the dichotomy of the business, how after all these years, I don't know. I published a book in 1998 on the 30th anniversary of the Martin Luther King assassination called Killing the Dream. And one of our favorites, it really was our own bias, but researching it was fantastic. And the James Earl Ray died a few weeks before that anniversary. That meant that the subject was back on the radar of the mainstream media in a way it's normally not. When that book came out, it was everywhere. I did 2 mornings of the Today Show back to back. I had at that time Charlie Rose for a double segment. Dan Rather did an hour documentary with the title of the book based on that. Then Frontline did it. It was on the front page of the New York Times with a review that said it reads like a detective story. Best reviews, most coverage I've ever had for a book, and we sold nothing. Because in the end, to the surprise of everyone, if you were sitting on the outside and watching that, you would say, that guy Posner is everywhere. They must be selling books off the truck like crazy. But people just weren't as interested. White Americans weren't as interested 30 years later about who had killed King. Black Americans, I think it was Ray and a group and a lawyer who paid him for it, a white supremacist out of the Midwest and his brothers. But Black Americans wanted J. Edgar Hoover to be shooting the gun in a dress or something. So it wasn't a big enough conspiracy for some. It was too small for another. You only know afterwards. The counterweight to this is that Tricia's last book, published in 2017, called The Pharmacist of Auschwitz, is about an ethnic German who lived in Romania. He was a Bayer pharmacist, country representative, and he later gets drafted into the Waffen-SS in the middle of the war, and he becomes the chief pharmacist at Auschwitz's dispensary, which means he's the one who gives out the Zyklon B. He steals gold from the mouth of the dead, and he leaves after the war and opens up a pharmacy in Germany, of course, and it takes 20 years to track him down. No one's told this story, little known story. When Tricia had this, it's been a long time passion of hers. There's a clip we have on YouTube about how she got interested in this back in 1985 when we met with Mengele's son, and he had mentioned this fellow's name, and she sort of kept it there. Well, when she finally went to try to find a publisher that was interested, every publisher said, oh, no, not interested, forget it, too many stories like that. One editor who will remain unnamed, so he said to her, I love this line, the Holocaust isn't trending. I thought that was an interesting way. So, all right, and what happened is, and my agent for books, you have an agent for books, wouldn't even represent her book because he said, I couldn't sell it to get any money for it at all. So she found on her own a little tiny publisher, 1-person operation out of the UK, who said, I'll publish your book. I can't give you an advance. We can split the royalties as they come in. Now that book was published without any fanfare, as opposed to the King book, which got everything. It got one review, a wonderful review in Kirkus, but otherwise wasn't covered by the main New York Times or anything else. And it built by something we hear about, but we all don't pay enough attention to. It's a great reminder for us, word of mouth. people buy books when a friend or colleague or somebody you trust says, I just read a great book. It's not because of a fancy cover or whatever else. Somebody says, yeah, I like this book. And you say, okay, I'll get that. I've done that time and time again. Word of mouth, we didn't know was building her book. Now it made the Wall Street Journal list at number 6 a year after publication, slow build. It's been translated into 17 countries, the book that nobody wanted. And I said, thank goodness for Tricia, because otherwise we'd be, short of paying the bills. But it goes to show you that, we're passionate about the subjects we do. We love it. And so for us, it's like being assigned a PhD thesis, or that we get to go off for a few years, do the research, come back, they're going to publish the book. We might get lucky and people will like it and buy it. But I'm reminded all the time to be humble about this business, because no matter how passionate I am about it, people may like it, they may not, they may be interested, and they may not be. So it's just as a reminder that you do what you love, and you hope that other people will enjoy it. So
let me just, number one, you have another lesson, and I have said this 1,000 times. The people in New York publishing don't know jack. That's number one.
Absolutely.
The second thing is, you've said that, I know I've done all my books on audio, that it's a lot of work. You have a beautiful speaking voice. Just listening to you, I would encourage you to rethink letting other people read your books, because you have a speaking voice and you love your subject.
Yeah.
That I think that comes through. And I listen to a lot of books, and I don't go to Audible. I go to Libby, because that's through the library system. And I'm going to go get your books. And I've listened to The Tattooist of Auschwitz, etc. So I have heard of Tricia's book. But I think another thing, oh my God, you write together with your wife and you're both still alive. That's a miracle.
Yeah.
What a great marriage.
41 years.
Yeah, we've been together 41 years, and we're very lucky on that. If you do, I will send to Anastasia, to Patricia, I'll send a link to a 3 or 4 minute video where we did a book appearance together in Miami a few years ago, and it has this little vignette about how she got into doing the book with me, but also how you got into the Pharmacist of Auschwitz. There's also a picture of us from 1980 in there, in which we look like people 42 years younger. It's amazing. So all right, but I will take up on that. And I do think often the New York editors on the big publishing houses, they don't always know what's right. They often are signing books that isn't correct. But the last thing, let's say,
in time.
yeah,
they're so antiquated. They just
it
can't
is
see.
antiquated. So they can't see a larger business often. But I will say this, here's the catch-22 of the business in some ways. So if I have a book, and I've had a couple of ideas that I've gone back to my editor with, and he wasn't excited about either of them. That's all right. I fought a little bit for them, but I obviously wasn't passionate enough to fight for them to this day. But let's say there was something that I thought was incredibly important. I had to publish it. The publisher said no. I went to other publishers and they said no. And I published that book on my own. The New York Times, the Washington Post, San Francisco Chronicle, those places that have reviewed me regularly over the years would likely say, gee, that guy Posner, he used to publish with Random House and Simon & Schuster. Now he's publishing on his own. He probably couldn't get a contract if his life depended on it. And I wouldn't get the reviews. Now that's interesting. You can do it for Tricia. You can come out and do it on your own, but there's almost what I call, you hear about the golden handcuffs at a corporation. They pay you so much money that you can't leave or you don't want to leave or whatever. The handcuffs in publishing are different. If you fall outside the traditional method, you fall outside the traditional review process. Now, that doesn't mean I'm going to get a good review, but you need to get those reviews, because they are the reviews that they sell to people who buy the books, but they sell basically to bookstores and to Amazon. So Amazon and bookstores on a great New York Times review will order 3 times as much. They'll promote the book more. That's why those reviews are so critical. And if you look through those reviews, you don't see self-published books covered really at all, because it's the untold exclusion that they have kept them out. And some of them are absolutely wonderful. I know that.
Well, we would love to talk to you forever and ever. I challenge all our members and guests please, in any way you possibly can, promote Gerald and Trisha's books. Write rave reviews all over social media, what a fabulous speaker he is. And for those in the National Speakers Association, now, can other bureaus book you through American Speakers Bureau?
Yeah,
They can do it through you.
absolutely. They can, or they can just ask Anastasia for my information, and this time I'll be a little wiser, and we can talk to them directly.
Okay, so you're not exclusive with
That's
them.
right. That's right.
Oh, then you definitely, whenever possible, if people know you, you should always book a speaker direct. They don't have to give out an enormous portion of their fee.
I am somewhat apologetic to an organization when I speak to them, because I think they're paying a large amount, and I know how much is going to the Speakers Bureau, and I sort of think, well, all right.
Probably 30%.
Wow.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. Well, you have big fans. Anytime you want to promote a book, practice a speech, we will take you any way you want to come back to.
I leave you with this. Here's where we could come back. Next year, Pharma will be a 6-hour documentary on Showtime. It's in the process. We're going back to New York now. It was bought by R.J. Cutler, the rights to it. R.J. Cutler is a documentarian who did The War Room years ago on the Clinton election. He's a wonderful documentarian. He has to then take it and try to come up with a treatment that will be sold to some cable or television channel. Showtime has agreed to run a 6-hour episode. So it's finished at the end of this year. It will air next year. And I will be happy to come on and we can talk then.
Well, we would love to have you. Just let Anastasia, me, anyone that you know here know. Thank you so much. There is no way any group could possibly enjoy you more. Yes, but not more.
There's Trisha.
Thank you.
And we want Trisha too.
Yeah, right.
Oh, yeah. He'll do it for me.
Yeah. Thank you all so much. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, much obliged.